You are listening to Action Design Radio, podcast of the Action Design Network, a globally recognized nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting all aspects of behavioral science. We bring you leading researchers and practitioners to discuss the latest behavioral science insights and how they can practically be applied to make a better world for all. Thanks for tuning in and enjoy today's episode.
Penn's Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences program congratulates our instructor, Zarak Khan, for co-editing the new book, Building Behavioral Science in an Organization, featuring MBDS Advisory Board members Charlotte Blank, Namika Sagara, Greg Schwartz, and MBDS alum Nicole Grabel. In the Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences program at Penn, students learn the theoretical and practical tools to address a variety of real-life problems and explore the science of decision-making using real-world applications and a hands-on approach. Check out our unique interdisciplinary program and see how you can start affecting changes in the world. Visit www.upenn.edu/mbds.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Action Design Radio. I'm your host, Zarak Khan. With me, as always, your other host, Erik Johnson. Hi, Erik.
Oh, it's good to be back after Chris took my place for an episode.
Yeah, I think you were at risk a little bit there.
I was a little concerned, so I'm glad I got called back in.
He was gunning for it. Yeah. And another familiar voice who was with us also in this last episode. Welcome back to Laurel Newman. Laurel, thanks for joining us again.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Zarak and Erik.
So as y'all will remember, Laurel is the behavioral scientist at Edward Jones, and she wrote the chapter on employee culture and human resources for our book, Building Behavioral Science in an Organization, which, fun announcement, we heard from our publishing friends at Action Design Publishing that we've downloaded or bought this book over 2,000 copies. That's pretty great. So thanks, everyone. We'll have Zach, our producer, just put in some like fireworks there or some kind of fun music. Yeah, exactly. So Laurel, we're excited to have you back. Last time, we were talking about sort of like the book overall, but we wanted to chat specifically about the chapter that you wrote. It's one of the sort of growing areas of application for behavioral science in an organization is in sort of HR and things that are focused on employees. And so, we were excited to dig a little bit deeper and maybe ask some questions that we didn't even get to in the chapter, but builds on the stuff that you wrote there. So maybe I'll jump right in with an opportunity for you to point out, the common sort of misunderstandings, maybe we might even call them mistakes, that you see people make when they're trying to motivate performance in some way, which is often like one of the key goals of nudging employees or influencing employees in some way.
Yeah, I would say one of the key mistakes that people make is jumping right to like extrinsic motivation. I think a lot of people think people aren't doing this because there's not a sufficient carrot or stick. So they jump right to like, how can we create an incentive, or how can we create a reward around this, or how can we track people and kind of acknowledge the people who are doing it. And those kinds of extrinsic things have some caveats or some drawbacks sometimes, like crowding out intrinsic motivation and having to get the incentives just right to make them effective. Especially jumping right to, what I think of it sort of as like an easy button, like let's just force people, like let's just create a punishment if they don't do it. That as an employer might be the easiest way for you to get people to comply, but there are some problems with that too, in terms of the culture that it creates, in terms of people maybe doing the bare minimum instead of really kind of buying into it or the spirit of why you want them to do it. So DC and Ryan have this nice model of motivation where they created sort of a table, and on the far left is like intrinsic motivation. I do this because I want to. I do this because of the rewards and benefits that are built into the action itself. And that's where we really want to dig in as much as we can, because the research shows that people, when they're intrinsically motivated, they're more creative, they work harder, they're more ethical, there are all these cultural benefits and well-being benefits, but it's not all like fuzzy. It's actually related to people's performance. They just tend to be more invested in the work that they're doing. So I would say kind of skipping the intrinsic motivation, because that might feel harder to people, and jumping straight to extrinsic is a big mistake. But also, I'll turn this a little bit on its head and tell you that I think a big mistake a lot of people do is just jumping to motivation, period. So, there are models of behavior like people have to be motivated, they have to be able, they have to have some kind of prompt or reminder. And oftentimes people attack what is really an ability problem with a motivation approach. And it would be better to kind of pause and say, okay, what's wrong with this process? Or why aren't people able to do this in the way that we want them to be, as opposed to saying, let's like incentivize them through this difficult process.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting points in there. One is that I do hear people pretty regularly just say broadly, like incentivize, like how do we incentivize people to do this? And they do kind of mean everything that you just said. Like, so there's not left necessarily like the level of nuance of sort of extrinsic and intrinsic, which I want to come back to that in a minute. But something that you just said jumped out to me as well, which is, I think ability, a lot of times people, maybe especially in HR, think about ability because they're responsible for training. And so they think about like upskilling as a way of increasing abilities, but maybe not so often think about like how to make something easier as a way of increasing ability. Would you agree with that? Is that sort of your experience as well? Or is that what you meant when you thought about ability?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think ability, kind of like motivation, there's like internal ability and there's sort of external ability. So internal ability is like, do you have the skills? Do you have the knowledge? And that's where HR often focuses on learning and training, mentoring, that kind of thing, to sort of upskill the person themselves. But there's a lot that we control in people's environment that makes their work and their success easier or harder for them. And that's where a lot of times HR people in general in companies don't pay as much attention to that. So things like removing friction from processes, also giving people tools, so that if something is challenging and people kind of fall down in a process at a given step, maybe give them a tool, or make the workflow easier for them so that they're not stumbling in those places. Defaults are like the sort of extreme version of making something easy, like you make them do literally nothing and now your goal is achieved. So there's a lot that we can do in the environment that makes the desired behavior easier for people. And that is an area that I think we should pay more attention to.
So going back to intrinsic motivation for a little bit, I think that oftentimes people think that, everyone is really like unique in their response. And maybe this is sort of like the result of just like economics training generally, but people think that the response to an extrinsic reward like compensation is pretty universal, right? Like you give people more and you're going to get more of this. And people think that intrinsic motivation is very like personalized, where it's almost like each person is kind of a snowflake and you have to use the exact right combination of words or design or something like that to increase their intrinsic motivation. But that's not really the case, right? I mean, there's sort of categories of intrinsic motivation that you can broadly use as at least sort of a quick start as you're starting to design. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is a lot of research around how to build intrinsic motivation in the same ways for everyone. So things like autonomy, mastery, like growth, social connection, purpose, tying into like how what you're doing matters for people's lives. Making things fun makes people more intrinsically motivated to do them. So in as much as you can sometimes create changes that raise those things for everyone, sometimes intrinsic motivation is easier to increase. Extrinsic motivation is just as complicated, if not more complicated, because you have to think about like, are we doing cash or non-cash rewards? And there are all these caveats to cash rewards. And if you're doing non-cash rewards, those are, to me, just as idiosyncratic. Like you want them to be meaningful to the person, you want them to be memorable, so I think both. You could get super idiosyncratic and kind of personalized with an intrinsic motivation or an extrinsic motivation approach, but you can also get pretty blanket with like an intrinsic motivation approach to purpose could be like, this is our organization's mission. and this is how your role ties into that mission. That's something that ideally every team would be thinking about in a place where the culture really is connected to the purpose that the company has.
One thing that kind of comes to mind as we're talking through this and I was reading your chapters, for a lot of the other aspects of the organization we talk about, there's like a very clear kind of like external person that is kind of the behavior we're trying to drive. So when you're marketing, selling, building products, all those things, there's like, here's our end customer and end user. And it's like, there's this almost like psychological distance of like, there's this person I'm serving. And it's interesting, like, when we think about from the human resources perspective, think about like intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. We're like, do you feel like maybe sometimes we almost forget that the company itself is a product for its employees, and maybe that like lack of frame of reference makes us not naturally think about these things in this type of way like we would in maybe a more obvious way when we're thinking about selling something or marketing and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's true. First of all, I think it's definitely true that people see the line of sight to the customer much more clearly. Like when we do a study or we have an initiative that increases customers buying our product or increases customer satisfaction or referrals or whatever the dependent variable is, they see value in that, like in dollars. I mean, it's a pretty clear connection to how we're now succeeding in a way that we weren't before. There are degrees of separation between dollars and motivating your employees in a lot of cases. So there's some research like by Doshi and McGregor on companies who have more highly intrinsically motivated employees. Those same businesses tend to have happier customers. So there's a lot of evidence that you can't sidestep employee satisfaction. It comes back to bite you through attrition, through poor customer service, through lack of innovation, through lack of teamwork, all these different things. But it's harder for you to see exactly how and to quantify that. And I think for that reason, people sometimes miss that opportunity because it is sort of, you have to kind of take it on faith that if we invest in our people, we're going to get better outcomes all the way around.
I also wondered to what extent it's an extension of just this notion that it always feels easier to try and change somebody else's behavior than to change your own, because I'm thinking, as you were talking through that example, and Eric, as you're asking that question, I was thinking of work that I've done in, industries with really high turnover, where it actually is pretty easy to see the dollar value, and you kind of do a little back of the envelope math, and maybe no one had actually sat down and done that before. But as soon as you kind of point out, like, you realize that it costs you, like several $1,000s or whatever, every time you have to replace somebody, they're kind of like, oh, well, we do that a lot, so it must be costing us a lot, and like, you can go and pretty quickly see, like, this is not just like a small expense budget or something like that, but this is like the equivalent of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And yet is still, I think, often like, maybe like a sort of almost like an intervention, right? Where it's like, I know I need to do better, but like still some kind of hesitance, or, maybe, I don't know if it's, do you think that it's like these people just need to have behavioral scientists working in their HR departments to help them actually turn that sort of desire into behaviors and actions? Or what do you think's going on there?
I mean, I think they need to have like brave behavioral scientists who are willing to kind of call out, like, who are strategic and willing to call out the source of the problem. So you're right that people will say, we have a lot of turnover, and every time somebody leaves, it costs us 3 times that much to replace, 3 times their salary to replace them and train them, right? We hear those kinds of quantitative estimates, but it's followed up by something like, help us figure out who to hire. Because the problem is that we're not hiring the right people. The problem isn't that we need to change anything internally, because that would be really hard. There's so many things to change internally. We don't know what's wrong. Instead, let's just hire people through a different process, and maybe they'll magically stay. And that might be the case. It might be that you do need to improve your hiring procedures, and it might be that there's nothing wrong. And once you get the right people and the right fit, things will be better. But it's likely that that's not all that's going on. There might be reasons why those other people are leaving that need to be addressed. And when you replace them, you're just going to see those people turn over. So I think that's what companies need really, is people who are like detectives, who want to really look at what's going on and be honest about what the source of the problem is, and kind of in good faith do their best to help move that forward with an initiative that's going to fix it. And that's hard to do because of the way that big companies are siloed, and oftentimes you don't have control over, say you're looking at a company and you can see that the problem is this thing here, but you don't control that thing. So how do you make an impact on that when it's outside of your control? So I think companies need to be much, I won't say much more because I'm not thinking of a particular company, but I think that companies need to think about themselves more collectively. We have a problem and we need to fix it, and then figure out where in our organization it is, and we invest in fixing it, as opposed to thinking about it like, this is my area, this is their area, and so that's their problem.
It's interesting too, because as we're talking about it, I feel like it's not even a problem that's necessarily unique to just thinking about like human resources and staffing, because companies also generally really underinvest in retention of their products, and they focus a lot on like sales. So I wonder if there's this almost like salience aspect where it's easy to see, oh, we had new sales and it gave us this much and marketing gave us this much. And it's very like, it's just easy to your point from before, it's like easier to make that connection to say like, we marketed, we got new customers and this is working, while ignoring like you could also probably spend an equal amount of money. Pretty much every study out there says that retaining customers is a lot more profitable over time than getting new ones. But very few every company has a marketing department, every company has a sales department. I don't know of any that really have a retention department to think about that kind of thing. So I wonder if it's like a similar, if it's not necessarily just, part of it is this bias of like an internal, you don't think about in your own house as much as you do your customers and things like that. Or if there's this kind of natural bias to this retention versus acquisition kind of mentality.
Yeah, there might be. I mean, there is definitely a bias, I think, in a lot of businesses for change, like bias in favor of change. The worst thing you can do is just stand still. And so change often feels like progress, even if we're not sure if it's progress. But I also think I also think that there's some justifiable fear that goes on when people change things internally that they don't worry about with clients. And I don't know if that comes down to like clients don't know, like customers don't know. You change your website and you give half your people this deal and half your people this deal, and they're none the wiser that other people got something they didn't get. And so people are more willing to experiment and test, and you have to experiment and test to be able to quantify the impact. And people are more willing to experiment and test when the people on the other end of it don't know that they're being experimented on. And I think a lot of companies worry that internally their people are going to have a low tolerance for being experimented on and a low tolerance for having things changed, because some people are going to be impacted negatively by a change, even if it's a small portion. And we all know about like loss aversion, and people hate for anything to get worse than the way it was before. So if things get better for 80% of the people and worse for 20%, is that a win? I don't know. You're going to be hearing from the 20%, so it might not feel like it. I think those are all things that people weight because they're, humans in charge of those decisions.
I want to come back to this in a little bit. We talk about sort of the if and how applying behavioral science, within an organization towards human resources is sort of different than other areas. But before that, we've talked about a couple different levers that people use, to apply behavioral science within HR. So some of them are kind of already traditional things we would think about of trainings, right? But, we talked about the hiring process and some other aspects. I'm wondering, like, if you had your dream team of detectives and you were, identifying problems and trying to move the needle on them, what are the levers that you think are sort of, either most important or maybe even most sort of underexplored?
Well, it would depend on what needle we were trying to move. I mean, that's something that I feel like is a drum that I beat everywhere I go, which is that like motivation is not a it's not a lever that's high or low for an individual. It's motivation to do what? I might be really motivated to go for a jog today, but I might not be motivated to do the dishes. And it's the same thing at work. We talk about people being motivated and what levers we would need, and it really depends on the behavior that we're trying to get them to do. So I guess it would kind of depend, like what levers I would want access to would depend on what we're trying to get people to do. But in terms of underexplored things, I think it's really the stuff we talked about earlier, like processes and workflow are really underexplored, ways that we can make people's jobs, make it easier for people to succeed. And I think we do a lot around leadership, and sometimes we don't do as much as we need to around role clarity and role fit, and making sure that people are in jobs where they feel like there's a great match between what they're good at and what the role needs for them. We don't do a lot of looking at how people spend their time and thinking about how time is a resource, and how does the way that we as an organization spend, and I'm thinking the generic organization, how does the way that people are asked to spend their time align to the value that they're bringing to the organization? So that's both the levers that we control, like training, is training really the training that you're doing, is that the best use of people's time? Are you really getting out of it what you think you're getting out of it and what you want to get out of it? Or are you checking kind of I don't want to say checking a box, because that sounds like people aren't trying, but there are opportunities to kind of re-examine the way that we've done things in the past, and face the limitations kind of in the eye and say, would it be better for people to do something like micro learning, where they're getting little bits of information here and there? Or am I making this learning applied enough for this role? I know when I taught a behavioral science curriculum before in a previous job, there was a lot of call to make it really applied for people. And I appreciate that, because people often can't make the leap from something conceptual that you're talking to them about. In the moment that they're doing their work, they don't see the connection and how to apply it. That challenge of, when we teach people information, how do we make it relevant and usable for them, I think is another opportunity.
Yeah, and that's an interesting example, because, like you said, it can seem maybe like it's just checking a box or something, but in reality, it probably isn't necessarily that kind of thing. But until you read behavioral science or listen to behavioral science podcasts, it's such a natural way to think, like, if we just need to give people information, we need better health guidelines. If people just knew what they should eat, then they would eat better. Or we need to give people more, when I worked in kind of the finance area, it was always this kind of joke around, everyone's like, oh, we need better financial education. Like, everyone in high school should take financial education and then we'd be fine. But we know financial literacy does not really translate to behavior. So it's not necessarily, I think in an HR sense, sometimes it can seem like these trainings and things are just like, oh, this want me to check a box. But it's really just like the natural way people think, oh, people need to do this thing, we just need to give them a training and they'll go and do it. And it's really just kind of like a mindset shift to think about, that information, changing behavior, not just giving information, that goes beyond and really to every kind of field and every discipline, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think when people start thinking about the behavior that they want, like the outcome that they want, it can help with that paradigm shift of thinking through, instead of leading with kind of the independent variable or the intervention, instead of leading with like training, we're going to do training. Instead, if we lead with the dependent variable or the outcome, like, what is it that we want? Well, we want them to learn this set of skills, and we want them to display this set of skills in this context. Okay, well, let's back up and ask, is training about information on that topic the best way to get them to that? I think that's one thing that behavioral scientists have to offer, is that shift. I think it's also like a natural way that humans think, that you lead with the independent variable. You lead with the let's try this, without necessarily stopping to really clearly articulate what is it that we're trying to accomplish. How do we know if we're accomplishing it? What measures do we have that would tell us if we're accomplishing it? Are these measures valid measures of the thing that we're trying to accomplish? Do they get at the whole construct? That's just identifying where you're trying to go, like what your outcome is that you want to accomplish. And I would always recommend that you start there and then you back into what's the best way to get there. And that's often not the way that organizations are run. They're often run according to this is the area that handles this independent variable, that handles this intervention or approach, instead of, thinking about what's the goal, and is there even a team that handles that, or a function that handles that, or is it cross-functional, or is it innovative and something that we've never tried before?
So then would you see a behavioral science team as like a layer that basically is coordinating to some extent? Like, you've got all these different tools within the organization for behavior change, and you have a team of detectives that are sort of trying to determine what the kind of underlying problem is, and then matching them up with those resources, or designing something new when the need arises? Or, what's your sort of blueprint for integrating a behavioral scientist here?
That's a good question. I think that what you described is what I personally would prefer. I used to kind of think that the magic of behavioral science was in testing and our ability to like experiment and isolate effects and quantify the impact on our dependent variables, and then estimate if we were to scale this up, what would the impact be? I still think that's really, really important. And we have to have behavioral scientists who do that at companies, because you don't want to just be going into your initiatives blind. You always want to test them. But I think the longer I do this, the more I realize that often we're brought in too late. Like we're told, here's the thing to test. And when you look at the thing that they're asking you to test, you're sort of like, well, I'm not entirely sure why you think that this would do the thing that you think it would do. And it's too late for you to have an impact on the strategy of how to solve the problem. So I do like the idea of the behavioral scientist as a strategist coming in and helping figure out, in as much as organizational success depends on human behavior, who is and isn't doing what you want them to do and why. Is it a motivation deficit? Is it that they're just forgetting and they need reminders? Is it that they don't have the ability or the time, or what's going on? And then build out a strategy that's going to solve those kind of underlying problems. That's the area that I'm probably personally the most passionate about, because I think if you get through that strategy phase and you've done it wrong, you build out all of this effort and all this testing to test the effort and the intervention. And it's like sort of for naught if you aren't taking the right approach to solving the problem.
Yeah, I think it's also in some ways, I mean, I guess not every way, but in a lot of ways, it's easier to start there too. With testing, I feel like it's like you have to do a lot of education almost, or like advocacy on behalf of like why you should run experiments. I mean, depending on the organization, right? But let's say it's an organization that's new to behavioral science and new to experimentation. You have to build the infrastructure to do it. Otherwise, it takes up a ton of time and like resources to run just a single test. And, you have to really hope that it works, because if it doesn't work, they're going to be like, we spent so much time on this and it didn't even do anything. Whereas I think it's relatively easy as a behavioral scientist to get invited to strategy meetings, because you can say things like, whoa, just presenting information to people doesn't change behavior. And somehow people are still sometimes amazed to learn that, and they say, hey, what else do you know? Can you come and tell me something about like my product or this project that I'm working on? So I mean, in some ways I could see that as, even though it's harder to sort of measure the impact, you have a lot more sort of like anecdotal kind of narrative firepower coming out of that, which might be even better as you're sort of starting to build, right? Because you could take that and turn that into, what we should really do is we should measure the impact of this, and you can sort of inch your way into that to where you end up building that infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. And it makes me happy to hear you say that, because that's been my experience. And I'm happy to hear that that's your experience too, because we've been at different places and worked with different people. I do think leaders often are eager to hear what behavioral science can contribute. And if you take that strategy approach, they usually like it, and want to add that way of thinking into the way that they're already thinking, like not replace it, but just add it in as another set of considerations. And definitely this sort of systemic way that psychologists or researchers think of everything is kind of in your head a model, and you think more sort of sociologically, almost like how are different things related to each other, and how does changing one thing impact these other things, and what comes before what in the chain of how things affect each other. And that way of thinking is pretty unique in a lot of business settings, and that alone can be really helpful in those strategy meetings for helping groups kind of clarify their own thoughts around their approach to a problem. And you're totally right. Once people invest in it and they say, okay, this is what we need to try. Let's try this to fix the problem, and let's build this thing out and see if it works. Naturally, they're going to totally say, how do we know if it works? And you're like, well, guess what? We've got a process for testing that. And it is going to be like a lot easier sell. And it's more likely that your study will work because you designed it from the beginning to be your best hypothesis.
Yeah, I was going to mention something similar, that it makes the testing aspect of it that much more seamless, and that it's sort of been baked in from the beginning when you're involved in kind of the strategy. And it actually, to me, so I was thinking as we were talking through this, that it loops back a little bit to the extrinsic and intrinsic aspect of it to some extent, because if you're saying like, I'm the behavioral scientist, I'm going to run tests for you, then you've kind of isolated yourself at this end point, which is almost this extrinsic type of motivation, like the compensation aspect, where it's like, oh, we're going to do all this work, and then the behavioral scientist is going to test it. And, so now there's this extra step, and that'll give us some data whether it works or not. Where when you can get involved in those strategy discussions, just the whole idea of modifying the environment and thinking of different ways you actually drive a behavior rather than just this test at the end, that actually bakes it into part of the process and makes it that much more natural. And to your point, it makes it a lot more easy. It makes it a lot easier or more natural for it to just end up with a test in the first place, at the end of the process. And generally would probably lead to better testing, because you're probably coming up with smarter hypotheses, and you're actually tackling more core problems rather than, like I said at the beginning, just kind of doing something it might not have a chance of adjusting behavior the way we want it to.
Yeah, I could see this being a nice segue into the sections in this book on integrated teams. And the idea, what we're talking about right now, is the idea that a behavioral scientist would kind of be integrated through a process of, there's a business problem. How do we know what's causing the problem? How do we address the problem and change the environment to fix it? How do we test it? The idea that you would be involved in that whole process, it seems like that would be you'd have to be integrated into a project team that's working on that. It's an interesting, I think, conversation to have around how you would structure behavioral science within an organization to be able to make this happen. I wonder if you guys think that that is the best way to do it, to try to have people kind of live with a project from the beginning to the end, so that there's some, I don't want to imply that a behavioral scientist is the only person that can provide continuity in a project from the beginning to the end, but I think it's way easier for us to have a positive impact when we're not sort of double dutching in and out of a problem, and we're there with the people as part of it.
Well, that's a lot of fodder for our chapters on integrated versus centralized team. But I think, yeah, and it's also worth thinking too, okay, at what point is it just a behavioral product manager, right? Like the person that runs the initiative has training in behavioral science too, right? So my sense is that there's probably a variety of ways of doing it that could be successful. And it might depend a little bit on what the project or product is, and sort of what the makeup of the organization looks like, and what the skill sets of the behavioral scientist are. In thinking about what your sort of ideal setup for behavioral science within, if you're focusing on culture or HR, what are the skill sets that you think a behavioral scientist needs there? And in what sense do you think that they're unique from, behavioral science skill sets and other applications?
I'll tell you, in a perfect world, what I think would be helpful. I think you have to be a pretty systemic thinker, because the things that impact employees are all around you. When you're working in product, for example, the things that impact customers are all around you too. But if you're looking at how do they interact with our app or something like that, there's going to be a limited number of things that you can alter and test in your app that would be logical to do. And so the amount of sort of expertise that you have to have, and the amount of things that you want to be able to test are sort of finite. Whereas when you're thinking about how are my employees gonna, how do I get the best out of my employees? How do I get them to be motivated, engaged, perform their best, develop into their kind of best versions of themselves, contribute to the company beyond first of all, that's a whole bunch of different dependent variables right there that I just listed. And so you have to figure out what is it that we're trying to accomplish. It could be something big like that. It could be something little like that. Like how do I get people to take their flu shot? Or how do I get people to sign up for this mentoring program or something? I mean, there are so many different things that we would want to influence. And then there are so many different factors that would impact those things, so many different independent variables for each of those dependent variables, that you have to be I think you have to think in terms of systems, so that you can cut right through and think about what are the logical best approach is going to be for this problem. I think it would be awesome if you're innovative and if you think about how you could integrate with other areas of the business, as opposed to like what levers are within HR, what levers need to be pulled or altered in order to accomplish the things that we're trying to accomplish. And why wouldn't those be available to me if we all share the same goal? Being a relationship builder is really important to be able to do that. Really having your eye on collectively, what are we trying to accomplish as a firm or as a company? Like what's our overall goal and purpose, and keeping focused with your colleagues on that goal is, I don't know if that's a trait, but I think that's a thing that really helps people in behavioral science to be successful. And I guess maybe like bravery, being willing to address when there is a hard problem that is the thing that needs to be addressed or fixed in a considerate, appropriate way. But there are a lot of variables, social, financial, political, that push people towards just kind of only controlling what they're given control of. And that's fine. And maybe this is more projection of my own value system. But I think really a lot of big change happens when we sort of shake up our thinking and really address like, what does the business need? Almost like it's like you'd ask yourself, like, what does my child need, or what does my friend need? Like, what does the business need? And let it flow from there.
Yeah, I think you definitely described a lot of the qualities too of just like a good leader, right? You're able to build relationships, you're able to kind of like identify core problems and think about sort of how you'd solve them using all the tools that an organization has at your disposal. Normally, the people that can sort of muster all of those things and build those relationships and pull those levers are the people that lead the organization. So maybe there's a new chapter for the next book of behavioral CEO or something like that.
I think, to build that point, I mean, generally people that are good leaders are really good with people for whatever reason. I mean, that's how you become a good leader. You know how to motivate people and connect with them. And behavioral science can offer you shortcuts to do that. I think a lot of people have learned how to become a good leader and how to connect really through almost just their own personal experimentation and just, thinking about being empathetic towards others. And I think it's kind of an interesting perspective to think about, in that behavioral science can give you shortcuts to do that, and like some really well-educated hypotheses of how to do that. So you don't have to, behavioral science is taking care of a lot of the homework for you. So
well said.
So as we kind of come to the close of our conversation here, Laurel, I just wanted to give you an opportunity. If there's any other sort of I always say this, and as I'm saying it, every time I do this with every single guest, I'm like, this is a dumb question. I should never end on this, because it's like anything else that you want to leave people with. And like, I feel like it puts a lot of pressure on you to like have some sort of like big insight. But if there's something that you feel that we missed that's sort of crucial from what you've written in the chapter that you want to make sure people pay attention to, I wanted to give you an opportunity to share that.
Gosh, one thing that we touched on that I would just highlight that's really important is we touched on this with respect to behavioral science in HR, but I'll just call it out more explicitly, is the need to prioritize. I mean, there are going to be a ton of different things that you could accomplish. There are going to be a ton of different ways that the organization could improve, from high level things like culture all the way down to little individual behaviors that you want people to do. So as a behavioral scientist in this area, if you have the ability to control these things, it's, I think, an important skill and need to work with your business partners, your leaders, to figure out, we can't do everything. What are the things that are going to create, what are going to be the highest priorities? What are the things that are going to create the most impact for the company? Because it would be really easy for me to get sidetracked by a lot of what I would think of as smaller projects that I could have more control over, a lot of nudges that I could roll out and test, and a lot of individual behaviors that I could tweak and quantify how many people did it before versus after, or in the control versus experimental group. But those individual behaviors might not be as important as some of the higher level things that are more difficult to move around. So maybe it comes down to having kind of a few projects, some that are higher level and more ambitious that are going to have more impact on the company, but be harder, and riskier. And then some that are kind of smaller, more controlled things that you just want to show progress and you want to improve the company in measurable ways. But I guess sort of balancing those things or figuring out the right outcomes that you're shooting for in terms of priorities would be important.
Great advice. I can personally attest to how challenging that can be when we get excited about this kind of work, it's our eyes are much bigger than what we can tackle on. So I'll co-sign. That's great advice.
So in closing here, Laurel, is there any, do you want people to follow you on Twitter or anything like that? Or do you just want them to get a copy of the book and read your chapter and highlight it and, put it under their pillow when they go to sleep?
If they want to do that, I see no reason why they shouldn't. I think I'm Laurel Newman 100, and I'm also on LinkedIn, and people can reach out and email me. I'm always happy to meet other behavioral scientists who are working in organizations. I have an academic background. I was a professor for about 12 years, and it's always fun talking to people about kind of the bridge from academic research to applied research in an organization. So yeah, I don't know if that's what you were looking for, Zarak, or they could just put the book under the pillow. Really, it's kind of up to them.
No, that's perfect.
I personally think it's much easier having the book under my head when I sleep. So
yeah. Well, Laurel, thank you for joining us. And also want to thank always with this series, the Action Design, for helping us publish the book, as well as Penn's Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences program. So thanks for listening in, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening. That concludes this edition of Action Design Radio, hosted by Eric Johnson and Zarak Khan. All podcast episodes are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and many other platforms where you might typically get your pod on. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Special thanks to Morgan Bortz for design, and as always, we would like to recognize Steve Wendell, founder of the Action Design Network, a nonprofit organization dedicated to spreading awareness about behavioral economics, psychology, and all things behavioral science in order to help you improve your life, your career, and your understanding of the world around us and the people in it. I am your producer and audio engineer, Zach Simon. For more cutting-edge behavioral science content, visit action-design.org. Once again, that's action-design.org. There, you can sign up for our newsletter and find an in-person event happening near you. We have chapters in over a dozen cities in the United States and Canada. Also, on our website, you can find additional notes and links regarding the topics discussed in today's episode. Thank you again for tuning in, and we will see you again soon.